I bought this farm early in the spring. Most of the land was still good. The soil was dark, the pasture stretched far behind the house, and the barns only needed a little work. The only thing the realtor warned me about was the old windmill. It stood in the back pasture beside a rusted cattle trough, tall, metal, and completely still. He pointed at it while we were walking the property. "That thing stopped working years ago." I asked him what it used to do. "It pumped water from the well," he said, "for the cattle." We walked closer. The trough below it was empty. Dry dirt had cracked along the bottom like it hadn't seen water in a long time. The metal pipe running from the windmill into the trough was rusted almost completely through. The blades above us didn't move, not even when the wind pushed across the pasture. "It's dead," the realtor said. "Hasn't worked in years." I didn't think much about it after that. Old farms are full of broken machinery. During the first week after moving in, I had too much work to notice anything strange. Fixing fences, cleaning out the barn, checking irrigation lines along the southern field. But one morning, something changed. I walked outside with a cup of coffee and looked across the pasture. The windmill was exactly where it had been before, standing tall against the pale morning sky. But the trough below it was full. Not half full, not rainwater, full almost to the top. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and walked toward it. The grass was wet with morning dew. The pasture was completely still. No wind, no sound. When I reached the trough, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Iron, wet soil, something deep and old, like water that had come from somewhere far underground. I leaned over the edge and looked inside. The water was dark, cloudy. The surface barely moved. I touched it with my hand. It was cold, too cold for a warm spring morning. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The windmill blades above me hadn't moved, not once. Without wind, there was no way it could pump water, and the old pipe connecting the well to the trough was rusted through. Even if the windmill somehow worked again, the water shouldn't have reached the trough. I looked up at the windmill. The blades were frozen in place. The metal frame creaked softly in the breeze, but it wasn't turning, not even a little. Then something moved in the water. Just a small ripple, slow, circular, like something underneath had shifted. I stared down into the trough. The ripple spread across the surface, then slowly faded. For a moment, the water became perfectly still again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe something fell in, maybe air bubbles from the old pipe. But that night, I decided to stay awake, just to see if something strange was actually happening. I turned off the lights in the house and sat by the kitchen window. From there, I could see the windmill clearly. Moonlight covered the pasture in pale silver. The trough sat below the tower like a dark rectangle in the grass. Everything was quiet. No wind, no insects, no animals. Nothing. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard a sound. Creak. The windmill blades turned. Slowly. Just one rotation. Metal scraping against metal. And the grass in the pasture never moved. Because there was still no wind. Then I heard something else. Water, dripping, from the pipe, into the trough. At first I thought I had imagined it. The windmill had turned once. Just one slow rotation. Then it stopped again. The pasture stayed perfectly still. No wind moved the grass. No branches swayed along the tree line. The blades should not have moved at all. I leaned closer to the window. The moonlight reflected off the metal tower of the windmill. Everything looked quiet again, frozen. But then I heard the sound. Drip, drip, drip. Water falling into the trough. I stepped outside onto the back porch. The night air was cold and still. From there I could hear it clearly. Water slowly dripping from the pipe into the metal trough below the windmill. The sound echoed across the empty pasture. Drip, drip, drip. That shouldn't have been happening. The pump system was broken, the pipe was rusted through, and without wind, the windmill should not have been able to pull water from the well. But the sound continued, slow, steady, like something underground was pushing the water upward. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and walked down into the pasture. The grass brushed against my boots as I crossed the yard. Every step felt louder than it should have. The windmill tower grew larger as I approached, tall and skeletal against the moonlight. The blades above were still again, not moving, not even slightly. But the water was still dripping. When I reached the trough, I shined my flashlight across the surface. The beam cut through the darkness. The water inside the trough rippled gently. Each drop from the pipe sent small circles across the surface. Drip, drip, drip. I lifted the light toward the pipe. Water was coming out slowly, just enough to keep the trough full, which meant the pump below the windmill had somehow started working again. But the windmill itself wasn't turning. I slowly aimed the flashlight up toward the blades. The metal arms cast long shadows across the pasture. Nothing moved. Then something made the beam shake in my hand. Footprints. They were pressed into the damp dirt beside the trough. Fresh. Boot prints. Leading from the windmill tower out into the pasture, then back again. I crouched down and followed the tracks with the light. They circled the windmill, again and again, as if someone had been walking around it for a long time. Hours, maybe. But the strange part was where the prints began. They started at the base of the tower, right beside the metal hatch that covered the well shaft. I moved the flashlight toward the hatch. The metal plate was slightly open, just a few inches, enough for darkness to breathe out from below. Cold air drifted up from the well. It smelled like wet stone and rust. I stood there, staring at the opening, trying to remember if I had ever touched that hatch before. I was almost certain I hadn't, which meant someone else had, or something else had. Then I heard it again. Creak. The windmill blades above me began to move, slow, heavy, grinding against old metal joints. But the air around me was still. Not even the grass moved. I slowly lifted my flashlight upward. The blades turned again. Another slow rotation. And then another. That's when I noticed something else. The pump rod inside the tower was moving. Up, down, up, down. Each motion pulled water from the well below. The sound of the pump echoed through the metal frame. Thump, drip, thump, drip. I slowly lowered the flashlight toward the open hatch again. The darkness inside the well looked deeper than it should have. Too deep for such a narrow shaft. For a moment, everything became quiet again. The windmill slowed. The pump stopped. The dripping water faded. Then something moved below. A faint sound, like wet hands sliding against metal. I held the flashlight over the opening, and deep in the darkness beneath the windmill, something moved. Something that sounded like a person climbing upward from inside the well. Then the windmill turned again. Another slow rotation, as if something below was still pushing the pump rod upward from the dark. I stepped back from the well immediately. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I aimed it at the open hatch. For a moment, nothing moved. The darkness inside the shaft stayed completely still. The windmill above me slowed again, then stopped. The pump rod froze in place, and the dripping water faded into silence. I stood there, listening, waiting for the sound to come back. But the pasture was quiet again. The same kind of quiet that had been there before midnight. No wind, no animals, just the windmill tower standing over me like a skeleton. After a few seconds, I crouched down beside the hatch again. The metal cover was still slightly open. Cold air drifted out from the well shaft. It carried that same smell from before. Wet soil, rust, something deeper, something older. I slowly pushed the hatch open a little farther with my boot. The metal creaked softly as it moved. The beam of my flashlight dropped into the shaft. The light didn't reach the bottom. It just disappeared into darkness. That well was deeper than I expected, much deeper. I leaned closer and aimed the beam straight down. The metal ladder inside the shaft ran along the wall. Rust covered most of it, but the rungs looked worn, like someone had used them recently. That didn't make sense. No one had been working on this windmill. The realtor had told me the system had been abandoned years ago. Still, those boot prints in the dirt beside the tower were fresh, and the hatch had been opened. I kept staring into the well for another minute. Nothing moved. No sound came from below, just darkness. Eventually, I closed the hatch again. The metal lid fell into place with a dull clank. For a moment, I considered locking it somehow, but I didn't even know if the windmill would turn again. So I walked back toward the house instead. The windmill tower loomed behind me as I crossed the pasture. Tall, silent, still. Back inside the house, I kept the lights off. I returned to the kitchen window and watched the pasture again. The windmill blades stayed frozen against the sky. The trough reflected the moonlight like a dark mirror. For almost an hour, nothing happened. No movement, no sound. I began to convince myself the whole thing had been some strange mechanical failure. Maybe underground pressure had pushed water through the pipe. Maybe the windmill gears had slipped. Maybe my imagination had filled in the rest. Then the blades moved again, slowly, almost gently. The windmill began turning once more. The grass in the pasture never moved. There was still no wind. The pump rod inside the tower started rising and falling again. Up, down, up, down. And with every movement, the sound of water returned. Drip, drip, drip. But this time something else appeared beside the trough. A shadow. At first it looked like the tower's shadow stretching across the ground. But the shape was wrong. Too narrow, too tall. I leaned closer to the window, trying to see it more clearly. The shadow shifted, and then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The shape wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure, someone standing beside the trough. The windmill blades turned slowly above them. The figure never moved, just stood there next to the water, watching the trough fill. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside. The moment my boots hit the grass, the windmill stopped. The blades froze. The pumping sound ended, and the dripping water faded away. When I reached the trough again, there was no one there, just the windmill tower, the trough, and the dark water reflecting the moon. But the surface of the water was still moving. Ripples spread across it in slow circles, as if someone had just stepped away from the edge, or climbed out. Then I noticed something rising slowly from the center of the trough, just beneath the surface. A shape, pale, almost the color of bone. And for 1 second, I realized it looked exactly like a hand reaching upward through the water. For a second, I couldn't move. The flashlight beam stayed frozen on the surface of the water. The shape under the surface moved again, slowly, rising toward the light. The water trembled. Small waves pushed outward toward the edges of the metal trough. Then the shape became clear. Fingers. Long. Pale. A human hand. It pushed up through the dark water and gripped the edge of the trough. The skin looked gray and soaked, like it had been underwater for a very long time. Water dripped from the fingers as they tightened around the metal rim. I stumbled backward. My boots scraped against the dirt. The flashlight beam shook across the pasture. The hand stayed there for only a second, just long enough for me to see it clearly. Then it slipped back beneath the surface. The water closed over it immediately. The ripples spread across the trough. And then everything went still again. I stood there, staring at the water, waiting for it to happen again. But nothing moved. The surface returned to that same dark mirror it had been before. The windmill tower above me creaked softly in the cold air, but the blades were still, completely still. Slowly, I stepped closer to the trough again. The flashlight beam slid across the surface. No hand, no movement, just the reflection of the windmill tower stretching across the water. I leaned over the edge. The water smelled stronger now. Iron, wet earth, something deeper, like water pulled from a place that had never seen sunlight. That's when I noticed something new. Marks on the inside of the metal trough, thin scratches, long, vertical, like fingernails had dragged upward along the metal wall. My stomach tightened, because the scratches started below the waterline and ended at the rim. Something had climbed out of that trough before, more than once. I backed away slowly. My eyes never left the water. The pasture around me felt larger than it had before. Darker. Colder. I turned toward the windmill tower. The open well hatch sat at its base, still slightly crooked from when I had closed it earlier. For a moment, I wondered if whatever had come up into the trough had come from there, from the well below. But the trough wasn't connected directly to the shaft. Water only flowed through the pump pipe, which meant something would have had to travel through the pump line itself. That thought alone made my skin crawl. The windmill suddenly creaked above me. Creak! I looked up. The blades began moving again, slow, heavy, turning against the silent sky. But the pasture grass never moved. There was still no wind. The pump rod inside the tower began rising and falling again, up, down, up, down. Each movement pulled more water up from the well. The pipe rattled softly as pressure built inside it, and then the water began pouring into the trough again. Not dripping this time, flowing, a steady stream. I stepped back as the water level began rising quickly. Within seconds, the trough was nearly full again. The windmill continued its slow rotations above, grinding metal against metal. Then the water inside the trough began to move. Not ripples, something larger. The entire surface shifted, like something beneath it was pushing upward. Two shapes appeared beneath the water. Two pale forms, slowly rising, one on each side of the trough. Hands, both of them, reaching upward through the dark water, gripping the rim of the metal trough, and pulling something heavy upward from below. The windmill blades turned once more above me. The pump rod slammed downward, water surged into the trough, and something beneath the surface began climbing out. I didn't stay long enough to see what it was. I ran back toward the house as fast as I could. Behind me, the windmill continued turning. Slowly, steadily, as if something beneath the ground was still pushing the pump, still bringing water up from the dark.
I didn't stop running until I reached the porch. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight when I unlocked the back door. Once inside, I shut the door hard and locked it. Then I turned off every light in the house and went straight to the kitchen window. From there, I could still see the windmill. It stood in the pasture under the moonlight, turning, slowly, steadily. The trough below it had already overflowed. Water spilled over the metal edges and ran into the grass. But the pump kept moving. Up, down, up, down. The windmill blades continued their slow rotations against the sky, and the grass in the pasture never moved. There was still no wind. I watched for several minutes, waiting to see if anything else would climb out of that trough. But nothing appeared. The water surface moved gently with each drop from the pipe. Then the windmill suddenly stopped. The blades froze in place. The pump rod inside the tower fell still, and the water stopped flowing. The pasture became quiet again. Too quiet. I stayed at the window for almost an hour. Nothing else moved. Eventually, the moon dropped lower in the sky, and the windmill became just a dark shape against the horizon. Sometime near dawn, I must have fallen asleep in the chair. When I woke up again, the sun was already rising. The pasture looked normal, peaceful, like nothing strange had happened at all. I walked outside slowly. The air smelled fresh and cold. Birds moved along the fence line. The windmill tower stood silent above the grass. When I reached the trough, the water inside it was completely still, clear enough that I could see the bottom. There was nothing inside. No hands, no movement, just dark water. I looked up at the windmill. The blades hadn't moved. The pump rod was frozen halfway up the tower. Everything looked exactly the way it had when I first moved in, like the whole night had never happened. Then I noticed something beside the trough. Boot prints. Fresh ones. They started at the metal rim, pressed deep into the damp soil, and they led away from the windmill. I followed them with my eyes across the pasture. The prints moved slowly through the grass. Step, 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 all the way toward the house. My stomach tightened as I realized where they stopped. Right at the back porch, exactly where I had run inside during the night. I turned slowly and looked down at the porch steps. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, but there they were. Wet marks, handprints, on the wooden railing beside the door, long streaks of muddy water running down the boards, like someone had grabbed the railing while climbing up the steps. I stared at the door handle. It was wet too, fresh water still dripping from the metal. That meant only one thing. Something had followed those footprints from the trough, across the pasture, all the way to the house, and it had been standing right outside that door, while I was inside. I slowly turned my head back toward the pasture. The windmill stood tall against the morning sky, silent, still. But the trough beneath it had started filling again, water slowly rising inside it, even though the blades above weren't turning. And somewhere deep beneath the ground, something was still pulling water up from the well, waiting for night to come again.